Next up, we have on Nevin from Reserve, who's going to talk about a new proposed derived regulatory framework. So let's give it up for Nevin.
All right, so I'm here today to talk about legalizing security tokenization here in the USA. I'm part of the Reserve ecosystem. I'm the president of Confusion Capital. We make grants in the Reserve ecosystem. We're not a VC. We have an interest in tokenization happening because the plan with Reserve is to have stable coins that are backed by super diversified portfolios of stocks and bonds and commodities and so on. So the central question here I want to start with is, will the US securities market move onto public blockchains? If we just let the apparatus play out, if we let the banks and the brokers and so on follow their incentives, will we end up in a world where you can withdraw your Apple stock as a token from your Schwab account and hold it, in self-custody, use it directly in DeFi on public blockchains? And I've been looking into this. I've been trying to predict whether this will happen by default. And the answer, I think, is no, for two reasons. The first reason is that the existing industry players don't particularly value freedom and programmability and permissionless systems the way that we do. And so all of the explorations of tokenization that they're doing tend to be about speeding up things in the background, stuff that's not going to lead to tokens existing on public blockchains. So that's not going to happen from that perspective, I think. Also, right now, even if we try to do it, there's a bunch of legal and regulatory barriers that are stopping this from being legal right now. And it's because of that right now we're seeing all these tokenization projects, tokenizing treasuries and equities and so on, offshore, basically offering the products to people outside of the US and just skipping the US market because of those regulatory barriers. So to try to think about, well, how could we make it work? How could we make a transition from the current system to tokens on public blockchains? It's actually been really helpful for me to understand the history of how we got from paper certificates for stocks to digital records for equity securities in the US. So the way that it used to work, a company would issue its equity and it would hire a transfer agent, which you still do today, to keep track of the cap table. And that would be tracked on paper with paper certificates. So the transfer agent is the one that would issue a certificate that would have somebody's name on it or have a broker's name on it saying, this is who owns this share in this company. And then the brokers would hold a bunch of those certificates and would hold them on behalf of the end holders. So anytime trades happened, the brokers had to physically sign those certificates back and forth or carry them back and forth, have the transfer agents update all those records on paper. And so it was a lot of manual paperwork. This is a picture from that time. This is the sort of thing that was happening in offices all over New York at that time. This led to what is called the Wall Street paperwork crisis of the 1960s. And what happened was the number of shares traded on the New York Stock Exchange per day went from 5 million per day in a 3-year period to 12 million per day. And it reached the point where literally the paper system couldn't work to settle everything in time. The SEC actually decided to just close the stock market on Wednesdays. So the stock market would be open for a couple days and you just have a day just to catch up and try to do the paperwork to settle, and then it'd be open for a couple more days. 1 in 6 brokerage firms failed. It was like a real crisis. And this was what ultimately gave motivation to switch to this new system. But the switch didn't just happen by itself. Actually, the New York Stock Exchange tried to create an electronic system. They even got laws changed to make it legal to have stocks not owned with a physical certificate. But that didn't work. The industry didn't switch. It only switched when this committee came together and did sort of a Herculean amount of work to figure out the optimal way to make it happen. And I want to share this story because it's inspirational for what I think we should be doing in order to make such a switch happen in this modern day. So this committee was called the Banking and Securities Industry Committee. The acronym was BASIC, and everyone talks about it as BASIC. This was formed in 1970 in response to this paperwork crisis. And the people in charge of the committee included a partner from PwC, chairman of the Morgan Guarantee Trust Company, the president of the New York Stock Exchange, the president of the American Stock Exchange, president of National Association of Securities Dealers, and the chairman of First National City Bank. The reason I'm reading all those titles to you is just so you can understand, these were top executives of the relevant financial companies of the day coming together to solve this problem. So it was a committee that was taken very seriously. They spent 2 years talking to a bunch of different industry groups and hearing out different possible solutions. They testified in Congress. They did a lot of work to figure out the master plan. And the master plan ended up being, okay, let's take all those stock certificates, all those physical paper certificates that are flying around, let's centralize them all in one building, and just use a computer to track who owns those shares instead. That was the basic idea. And so they did that. And that was what led to the formation of the Depository Trust Company. That was the company where all of those certificates ended up in one place, and they started using computers to track the ownership back and forth. And that's how it still works today. The physical certificates don't really exist anymore. It's all just pretty much book entry at this point. But the system that was created in the early 1970s is still what we're using right now, and we switched to it because of that crisis. So I think that's useful context to have in mind. And so that's still how it works today. So a company issues its shares, transfer agent is the one keeping track of the shares, they have that ultimate responsibility, but most of those shares just sit at the Depository Trust Company, or at least in terms of book entry records. And then the Depository Trust Company keeps track of which brokers they're holding the shares on behalf of, and then the brokers keep track in their own databases of which end holders they're keeping track on the basis of. Notably, the DTC and the transfer agents usually don't know the identities of the end holders. That's just tracked at the broker level. So the broker dealers are the ones doing the KYC and tracking that identity information. Okay, that was just context. Now I want to talk about a direction that I think could make sense in order to get all these things to exist as tokens on public blockchains. What if there was another company that existed on the same level of the system as the DTC, call it, for the sake of conversation, the TTC, the Tokenized Trust Company, where the Tokenized Trust Company would hold shares just like the DTC does, but instead of holding them and just having an internal database keeping track of which broker has the shares, they would just issue tokens that are, like we're used to with stablecoins and so on, redeemable one-to-one for those shares. And so then end holders could hold those directly, self-custody, transact in DeFi, etc. Technologically, this would not be that difficult to do, and it also would be very easy to do from a coordination standpoint. It's nothing like that evolution we just talked about, where you needed, perhaps hundreds of different companies to all switch the way that they did something at the same time. What's really elegant about this approach is you just need this one new company to be approved and to be able to do this activity. And the ability to transfer who owns the shares at the transfer agent level, that's already part of the system. So the whole financial system can just keep going exactly as it is today, except these tokens can start popping out and you can do other things with them on the side without having the existing stack to really need to change itself at all. And just to illustrate the point about the transfer agent, you can actually already take possession of an equity security directly if you want to. You could buy it through a broker and get the transfer agent to transfer and hold it in your name. So it'd be the same type of operation, but just with this company in order to tokenize things. Okay, so that's the general direction I'm pitching here. Now, the question of, well, can we do this? Why haven't this happened already? The answer is basically, no, we can't do this right now. This is just probably not legal or allowable under the current conditions. And people tend to focus on laws. They tend to focus on, okay, well, what would Congress have to pass to make this happen? And there might be statutory change necessary, but there might actually not be. You have to look at the level of regulations and rules of the relevant entities that have direct supervision over this ecosystem, and that's the SEC and FINRA majorly. So the SEC creates regulations, FINRA has their own rule set that you'd have to look at, but also you need to look at the sentiment. Right? There are people who have discretionary power in these organizations that even if all the rules and regulations said it was fine, they wouldn't necessarily approve of this sort of thing, and they would need to. They would need to say that, yes, the TTC is a legitimate entity, we're going to oversee it, etc. And so you have to think about their political context. Who appointed that leadership? Are they going to lose points in their political tribe if they do this? And so this is a sort of deeply political negotiation that needs to happen if we're going to succeed at what I'm proposing here. So with that in mind, I want to focus the minds in this room and anyone who watches this video on YouTube or whatever on what I have learned is the biggest sticking point in that negotiation between the blockchain ecosystem and those political forces and the regulators and the powers that be. As far as I can tell from looking into this, the biggest sticking point is KYC. And you might think, well, the SEC is not really, they're not like a money laundering, monitor primarily. They're about investor protection. That's true. But if you actually talk to, I've had a few conversations informally with people at the SEC about this and some other people in the ecosystem, the number one point that comes up is, well, what about KYC? How is that going to be handled? And so there's this really big challenge of KYC versus freedom and programmability. We don't want to implement a KYC system that just sort of hamstrings, the things that we're here to do in the first place in terms of, permissionless systems. So really the big question is, how do we get approval without degrading the freedom and programmability of permissionless systems? So, some directions to think about here. I don't think any of these are the answer, but I'm trying to, rally people in this ecosystem to figure out the answer with me. You could think about, what if there was KYC just on the front ends, right? So, automated market maker contracts to trade these tokens, everything's permissionless on chain, but the front end websites are maybe, registered broker dealers and they do KYC. The obvious problem with that is anyone can spin up a website, so there'll be all sorts of unofficial websites where people can get around that system. And so that might mean that it is politically infeasible to make an agreement with that direction. Maybe not, but I think it would probably not work. Another direction that people think about is, what if there's some sort of on-chain attestations of off-chain KYC? So, you can do this today with Coinbase. Coinbase will put an attestation on-chain saying that address is owned by someone that we have KYC for. They don't say who. They don't reveal any information about you other than they have KYC on you, right? You could imagine security tokens where the token can't be transferred to any address that doesn't have such an attestation. But there's all sorts of issues that crop up with that. What do you do with smart contracts? They can't get that attestation, most likely. And then those smart contracts, any tokenized positions that they offer, do they have to inherit the same restrictions? It gets pretty complicated. I'm interested in spending hours thinking through that with, engineers who want to talk about that, but I haven't seen a way to do it yet. Other people say, well, why not just have no KYC at all? Like, let's just try to, push through and somehow make this happen with no KYC at all. And, that I think the most plausible way that could happen is if these offshore tokenized securities get really, really big, and that lasts for 5 years, and, the world figures out AML approaches to all of that, kind of how we have with current crypto. Maybe we would get to a point where it'd be like, maybe we just don't need it because we have all these other tools to analyze, It's possible. I mean, I don't think so, but that's one direction. And then similarly, going offshore, that's what we're doing today. We're just sort of skipping this question already entirely, but I don't think that can necessarily last because those permissionless tokens that are being issued offshore, they're going to flow back into the hands of US people. If that gets really, really big, we might end up having a fight over that. The other issue is that those US securities originate from the US. So if you're tokenizing treasuries, you're tokenizing US equities, you're inherently on the back end somehow connected to the US system. So the system can end up exerting leverage over you in one way or another. So to those who want to add KYC, the question I have for you is, how does your approach preserve permissionless transactions? And to those who want no KYC at all, my question is, how does your approach allow securities, which are already heavily regulated, to enter the system, with no KYC at all? And I think a really good answer to either of these questions, that's a plan that would actually cut through those problems and make this possible, would be worth $100 million. An answer to this question would be so valuable because it would allow, all of this amazing infrastructure that's being built in DeFi to be used with, the biggest, asset classes in the world. And we don't actually have a good answer to these questions yet. So I think probably the right direction is to form an industry committee of some type that's kind of like Basic 2.0. Well, like the committee that came together to solve this last time, but with a different target, different ethos. I think that needs to be staffed with really smart lawyers and engineers because there's a lot of legal thinking, but also technical thinking to figure out, how do you solve not only the KYC issue, there are also other issues you have to deal with. But I think that committee probably needs to be chaired by, I would guess, academics and maybe former regulators, because it needs to be people that we would respect and that people in Washington would also respect. And so I'm interested in bringing together a sort of Basic 2.0. And so that's what I wanted to share today. As for next steps, I think right after this, I think it's scheduled at 1:30 in the workshop space, which is back there. I'll be talking about this in more depth with anyone who wants to have a discussion about it, because there's no time for questions right now. I'm already in contact with the Mercatus Center, a couple of law firms who we're talking to about this, the SEC itself, Coin Center, Blockchain Association, and Chamber of Digital Commerce to think about, how this could be brought together. I want to meet Alex Grieve from Paradigm, G. Kim from the Crypto Council for Innovation, Bill Hughes from Consensus, and Miller Whitehouse Levine from the DeFi Education Fund. I think those people would be useful to talk to. So if anyone wants to make an intro, happy to take that intro. And I forgot to say this at the beginning, so please leave this slide up for like 30 seconds. That QR code on the top right is to a Telegram group you can join if you actually care about this issue and you want to be in an ongoing discussion on this topic. Please take a moment to scan that if your phone can read it and join that Telegram group for follow-up conversation. Thank you very much.